January 22, 1945. Noon. Somewhere in the frozen fields south of the Sauer River, Luxembourg, the air smelled of wet wool and diesel exhaust. Snow clung to the edges of burned-out farmhouses, and the mud beneath had frozen into ridges that cracked under the weight of American boots. A column of captured German officers stood in a line outside a commandeered stone barn, their breath visible in the cold, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Among them stood a man whose uniform, though mudded, still bore the insignia of rank, a Wehrmacht colonel, his jaw set, his hands bound loosely at his wrists. Inside the barn, Third Army staff officers sorted through papers and maps by the light of kerosene lamps. The smell of coffee mixed with the dampness of hay. And then the door swung open, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stepped inside, his polished cavalry boots clicking against the stone floor, his ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. He carried with him not just authority, but a kind of violent elegance, a man who believed war was an art form, and he its most devoted practitioner. The German colonel was brought before him. Through an interpreter, the exchange began. Patton asked for the colonel's cooperation, information about remaining Wehrmacht positions, supply routes, the strength of units still dug in along the Siegfried line. The colonel's reply came slowly, each word deliberate, his voice steady despite the cold and the exhaustion. "I will not betray my country. I will not betray my men. You will have to kill me." The interpreter hesitated before translating. Patton's eyes, pale and piercing, remained fixed on the German officer. There was a silence in the barn that seemed to expand, filling every corner. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, no one moved. And then Patton did something no one expected. To understand what happened in that barn, you must first understand the war that brought these two men together. By January of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter offensive, had been broken. American, British, and Soviet forces were closing in from all sides. The Rhine had not yet been crossed, but it would be soon. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but how many more would die before it did. Patton had spent the past 6 weeks driving his Third Army through snow and sleet, relieving Bastogne, smashing through German defensive lines, pushing east with a fury that both awed and unsettled his peers. Eisenhower called him indispensable. Bradley called him reckless. His own men called him old blood and guts, though some muttered that it was their blood and his guts, but none could deny his effectiveness. By the time his forces reached the Sauer, they had taken thousands of prisoners, destroyed dozens of German divisions, and carved a path toward the heartland of the Reich. Yet Patton was not merely a warrior. He was a student of history, a reader of Caesar and Napoleon, a man who believed that the soul of a soldier was forged not just in battle, but in the confrontation with mortality and meaning. He despised cowardice, but he respected courage even in his enemies, especially in his enemies. For Patton, war was not a matter of politics or ideology. It was a test of manhood, of will, of destiny. The German colonel who stood before him embodied something Patton recognized, the old code of the officer class. Loyalty, duty, honor, these were not uniquely American virtues. They were the inheritance of soldiers across centuries and borders. The Wehrmacht was not the SS. The regular German army had fought with discipline and skill, and though they served a monstrous regime, many of its officers saw themselves as patriots defending their homeland, not as fanatics advancing genocide. Patton knew this. He also knew that the colonel's refusal was not bravado, it was principle. And in that moment, Patton made a choice that revealed as much about his own character as it did about the nature of command. He walked closer to the colonel. The interpreter tensed, unsure of what was coming. Patton studied the man's face, the lines carved by sleepless nights, the frost clinging to his stubbled chin, the steady gaze that did not waver. Then Patton spoke, his voice low and firm, and the interpreter translated. I will not kill you, Colonel, and I will not ask you to betray your men." The colonel blinked, confusion flickering across his face. Patton continued, "You have fought with honor. You have led your men with courage. That is all any soldier can do. The war is over for you. You are my prisoner, but you are still an officer. I will treat you as such." He gestured to one of his aides. "Get this man a coat. Get him hot food. See that he is placed with officers of equal rank." Then he turned back to the colonel. "You do not have to help me win this war, Colonel. I will win it without you. But you do not have to die for a lost cause either." The colonel stood silent. His throat worked as if he were trying to swallow something bitter. Then, slowly, he nodded. It was not submission, it was acknowledgement. One soldier recognizing another, Patton walked out of the barn. Behind him, the staff officers exchanged glances. One of them, a young captain, later wrote in his diary, "The old man could have had him shot. No one would have questioned it." But he didn't. He gave him his dignity instead. What Patton did in that moment was not mercy in the sentimental sense. It was strategy. It was psychology. And it was something deeper, an assertion of what he believed separated the American way of war from the totalitarian cruelty of the Nazis. Throughout the European campaign, Patton had wrestled with the paradox of fighting an enemy that mirrored, in some ways, his own martial ideals. The Wehrmacht was a professional army. It valued discipline, tactical brilliance, and the warrior ethos. But it served a regime built on barbarism. The Nazis had turned war into extermination, honor into atrocity, and courage into complicity. Patton despised the Nazis with every fiber of his being, not because they were soldiers, but because they had perverted what soldiering meant. Yet he also understood that the average German soldier, the man in the trench or the tank or the frozen foxhole, was not so different from his own troops. They fought because they were told to fight. They followed orders because that was what soldiers did. They died far from home, in mud and blood, clutching letters from wives and mothers they would never see again. Patton did not excuse the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes. He knew about the atrocities. He had seen the camps. He would later walk through Buchenwald and vomit at the sight of stacked corpses and emaciated survivors. But he also knew that dehumanizing every German soldier was not the path to victory. It was the path to becoming what you fought against. And so he treated his prisoners with a kind of calculated respect. He gave them food when his own men were hungry. He allowed captured officers to retain their rank and dignity. He interrogated them with firmness but not torture. He did this not out of kindness, but out of a belief that this was what separated democracies from dictatorships: the rule of law, the restraint of power, the acknowledgement of shared humanity even in the crucible of war. It was this philosophy that made American captivity different. German soldiers feared being captured by the Soviets. Rumor and reality painted a brutal picture of slave labor, starvation, and execution. But being captured by the Americans was different. Word spread through the Wehrmacht grapevine: surrender to the Americans and you would be fed. You would be warm. You would survive. It was this knowledge, more than any propaganda, that eroded German morale in the final months of the war. Men began to surrender not because they believed in defeat, but because they believed in survival. Patton understood this. Every prisoner who surrendered was one less soldier shooting at his men. Every act of basic decency was a weapon in the psychological war. And every German officer who was treated with honor became a story that spread through the ranks, that weakened the resolve of those still fighting, that chipped away at the ideological armor of the Third Reich. The colonel was given a wool blanket and a tin cup of hot soup. He was placed in a transport truck with other captured officers and driven to a POW processing center near Arlon. Along the way, he sat in silence, his hands still bound, his mind churning. He had expected execution. He had expected cruelty. Instead, he had been given warmth and bread. In the weeks that followed, he was moved to a larger camp in France, and then eventually to a facility in the United States. He would spend the remainder of the war behind barbed wire, but he would survive. And years later, long after the war ended, he would write a letter to the U.S. Army Archives. In it, he described that day in the barn. He described Patton's words, and he wrote this: "I had been prepared to die. I had been taught that the Americans were soft, that they valued comfort over courage, that they would break under pressure. But that day, I learned something different. I learned that strength does not require cruelty. I learned that a man can be powerful and still be just. I learned that perhaps we had been wrong about many things." The letter remained in the archives for decades, unread by most, a footnote in the vast machinery of history. But it was a testament to something profound, that even in war, even in hatred, the choices we make ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. Patton did not speak often about mercy. He spoke about victory. He spoke about aggression, speed, audacity. He believed that hesitation killed more men than bullets. He pushed his troops harder than almost any other commander. He demanded perfection and punished failure. He was, by many accounts, a difficult man to serve under, temperamental, profane, unforgiving. But he was also a man of contradictions. He wept when he visited field hospitals. He wrote poetry in his private journals. He believed in reincarnation, convinced that he had fought in ancient wars, that his soul had been a soldier in Rome, in Carthage, in the Crusades. He saw himself as part of an eternal chain of warriors, bound by a code that transcended nationality or era. And it was this code that governed his treatment of the German colonel. Not the code of the Geneva Convention, though he followed it. Not the code of military law, though he obeyed it. But the older code, the code of the warrior who recognizes his mirror image in his enemy, who knows that courage is rare and should be honored, even when it is pointed against you. This was not weakness. It was the opposite. It was the confidence of a man who knew he would win, and who could afford to be magnanimous because victory was certain. Patton did not need to kill the colonel to prove his power. His power was self-evident, and so he chose to wield it differently, not to destroy, but to demonstrate. Throughout the winter and spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army continued its relentless advance. They crossed the Rhine in March. They liberated Buchenwald in April. They drove deep into Bavaria, into the heart of the Reich, their tanks rolling through towns where white flags hung from windows and German civilians stood in silent, stunned defeat. Patton himself was conflicted about the endgame. He wanted to push further, to drive into Czechoslovakia, to confront the Soviets before they claimed too much territory. He distrusted Stalin and feared that the post-war settlement would trade one tyranny for another. Eisenhower reined him in. The political decisions were being made above his pay grade. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. But for Patton, the war was never truly over. He believed in perpetual struggle, in the necessity of conflict to test and refine the human spirit. He saw peace as an interlude, not a conclusion. And in the months after Germany's surrender, he grew restless, frustrated, increasingly outspoken. His comments about the Nazis, his suggestion that former party members could be useful in rebuilding Germany, caused scandal. His disdain for Soviet communism bordered on insubordination. In December 1945, he was relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to a paper-pushing post. 9 days later, he was gravely injured in a car accident. 12 days after that, he was dead. He never saw the full consequences of the choices he made. He never knew about the letter from the German colonel. He never knew how many enemy soldiers surrendered because they believed the Americans would treat them fairly. He never knew how his example, his insistence on honor even in brutality, would be studied and debated by historians and soldiers for generations. But the choices remained. They outlived him. There is an object that threads through this story, almost invisible but always present. It is the tin cup, the one filled with hot soup and placed in the hands of the German colonel. It was an ordinary thing, dented and stained, issued by the thousand to American mess units. But in that moment it became something more. The tin cup represented abundance. Not wealth, not luxury, but the basic capacity to care for prisoners, to feed men who had tried to kill you, to extend warmth even when you had every reason to withhold it. The Nazis had run concentration camps where people were starved to walking skeletons. The Soviets would march German POWs into Siberia, where thousands died of cold and hunger. But the Americans had tin cups of soup. They had rations to spare. They had the logistical might to feed their enemies. This was not incidental, it was foundational. American power in World War II was not just military, it was industrial, it was agricultural. It was the sheer, overwhelming capacity to produce tanks, planes, ships, bullets, food, clothing, medicine. The United States outproduced the Axis powers by orders of magnitude, and this abundance translated into a kind of confidence. You could afford to feed your prisoners because you had enough food. You could afford to treat them humanely because you were certain you would win. The tin cup was also a symbol of democracy, not in the abstract, not in speeches or propaganda, but in practice. It represented the idea that even an enemy, once disarmed, had basic rights. That power should be restrained by law. That might did not make right, but that right, backed by might, could build a better world. Patton, for all his flaws, understood this instinctively. He was a warrior, but he was an American warrior. And that meant something. It meant that victory was not just about destroying the enemy. It was about proving that your way of life, your system of values, was worth fighting for. And that proof came not just in battle, but in the moments after, when you held power over a defeated foe and chose justice over vengeance. The tin cup was handed over, the soup was drunk, the war went on. But in that exchange, something shifted. A man who expected death received life. A soldier who expected cruelty received dignity. And the American idea, fragile, imperfect, often betrayed, but never entirely extinguished, proved itself once more. Years later, long after Patton's death, a young German historian researching the final months of the war came across the letter from the colonel. He tracked down the man, now elderly, living in a quiet village in Bavaria. They sat together in a small kitchen, the afternoon light slanting through lace curtains, and the historian asked him to tell the story again. The old man, no longer a colonel, no longer a soldier, just a man with liver spots on his hands and grandchildren's drawings on his refrigerator, spoke slowly. He described the cold, the barn, the interpreter, Patton's eyes. The soup, why do you think he did it? The historian asked. The old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said because he could, because he was strong enough to show mercy. And because he wanted me to understand what I had been fighting against. And did you, the historian asked, did you understand? The old man nodded. Not that day, but later, yes, later I understood. War is brutality. It is death and suffering, and the destruction of everything tender and good. It is men killing men for reasons they often do not fully understand, in service of causes that may not deserve their sacrifice. It is the worst of what humanity is capable of. But war is also revelation. It strips away pretense. It exposes the core of who we are, individually and collectively. It shows us whether our ideals are real or merely rhetoric. It tests whether we can be powerful and still be just, whether we can be victorious and still be humane. Patton believed that war was inevitable, that it was part of the human condition, that it revealed greatness or mediocrity with unforgiving clarity. He may have been right. Or he may have been a man so in love with the romance of battle that he could not imagine a world without it. History has not yet decided. But in that barn, on that frozen day in January, he made a choice. He looked at a man who had sworn to fight him to the death, and he chose not to kill him. He chose instead to